The 6502 family is large, convoluted, and poorly labelled. We start with the nominal 6502, which is NMOS, sometimes referred to as the N6502. This was converted to HMOS with the 85 series, but is functionally identical. The Nintendo NES or Famicom uses the 2A03 variant of the NMOS, and minus BCD it's identical. We then have a theoretical 65C02. To my knowledge, there are no strict C chips. This is just a catch-all for everything a C family supports. Rockwell were the first to make a 65C, and so we have the R65CO2 to denote their specific brand and blend. Hudson then took the R65CO2 and made the HUC6280, which is very strange. Moved the zero page to the middle, added 2 megabytes banking, couple of data ports Z80 style, few extra status flags. It's trippy. Then the Western Digital Center took the R65CO2, added a couple instructions to it to make the W65CO2, then took out the extra bit instructions from it to make the 65CS02. Then Commodore took the R65CO2 and then extended it in their own ways and made the 65CE02, which was then bolted to 2 CIAs to make the 4510, which was to appear in the Commodore 65, and subsequently the Mega 65 team have evolved the 4510 even further. I'm going to assume that everybody is fully familiar with the base 6502. I've seen a lot of people mention and query about the unintended opcodes and the illegal opcodes. This is basically because each opcode is a bunch of bit signals which is then decoded by an internal ROM. To make it so that the unintended opcodes or unused values don't do anything, you would have to extend the ROM and put in a bunch of extra logic to trap it. Their idea was, save the money, just don't use those bytes. Some of those bytes do some things useful. Some of them just lock up the CPU. And it's 100% dependent on the exact layout and form and process of the chip. So they generally can be a bit random across chips. In the Commodore community, we use them extensively because every Commodore has a stock MOS chip, and we know we will have a MOS chip. For example, you can't use them in the Apple scene because some Apples have a 65C02 which does not have the opcodes. It's worth noting the 6502 had a few bugs left in it. The indirect jump page crossing boundary, that's a doozy. The D flag not being cleared in interrupts can bite you sometimes too. The Nintendo Famicom or the NES, as I said earlier, uses an N6502 base. They removed access to the BCD commands, added a sound generator and a DMA system, but apart from that it seems fully functionally identical, even with the illegals. It's also worth noting there is a pile of variations of the 6502, the 6503, the 6504, the 6505, 6, the 7, which was used in the Atari VCS or 2600, the 6510, the 6501/1. There's lots of them. It's also worth noting that there are other versions with letters after the name. So you have the 6502A, the 6502B, and the 6502C. These denote the maximum operating speed the chip is rated for. So A is for 2 MHz operation, B means 3 MHz operation, and C means 4 MHz operations. It's important to note that the 6502C is not the same as a 65C02. They are very different chips. So the 65C02. This is the base of the Rockwell Enhanced 6.5. They made a lot of nice quality of life upgrades, bug fixes. The 6.5 CO2 is a lot nicer to develop for than the 6.5 O2. They also fixed some of those nasty bugs. But it's worth noting they do not have any of the unintended or illegal opcodes. There is no support for them. And any opcode that is not allocated in the 6.5 CO2 has been converted to a NOP. I guess they saw the problems with the 6502 and decided to stop it. So what do you get? The main thing you get is X and Y index updates. You now have push X and push Y, pull X and pull Y. So no more TXA, PHA, etc. You can just push them to and from the stack as you please, which is handy when you need to do it, because you don't have the trash A anymore. Also, there's TXY and TYX, so you can just move the value between the indexes without trashing A. Also very handy. BRA has been added, which is just branch always. It can save you some bytes, make your code a bit faster. It's useful for relocatable code, so for those people trying to make custom load drivers that work for all the plugin cards, BRA might be very useful. STZ is another nice addition. It just lets you store 0 without having to have it in a register somewhere. Useful for clearing a flag or a register or something. DRB and TSB, it lets you test if a bit is set or clear, and then it will set or clear it in one opcode. So, load value, end flag, push the status flags, clear it, load the status flags, and branch is now just reduced to one opcode. Very handy for drive-based code and stuff like that. Not something you really use normally. There's new addressing modes. You can now do inc A, which just adds one to the A register. And the absolute nectar of the gods. How many times have you wanted to do indirect access via the 0 page, but you've got to put $y, and you need to have the value, because it's important. So you got to stash it somewhere, and you've got to load Y with 0, and then you got to pull it back out of the stash. Now you can just drop the Y. You don't have to put a $y at all. Everywhere you could do 0 page $y, you can now just do bracket 0 page. So good. So then we get on to the R65CO2. So this is as per the 65CO2, but due to its embedded nature, they've added a lot of bit-based operations. So BBR, branch bit reset, aka if this bit of this byte is 0, then branch. BBS, branch bit set, aka if this bit of this byte is 1, then branch. You then have RMB, reset memory bit. So this lets you clear a bit in a byte, and then set memory bit lets you set a bit in a byte, and they both preserve A. So you can set, start the timer on CIA or VIA1, etc. without having to modify A. Nice for some very tight drive code, but again, not really useful in the generic sense. Then the W65CO2 is as per the R65CO2, only they added the STP or stop instruction, which holds the CPU, puts it in a low power mode, and I think it waits until it's reset before continuing. It's useful for embedding applications, not really for a generic computer. The WAI instruction, wait interrupt. This puts the CPU into a wait state, and it will only continue execution once an interrupt has fired. It does not run the vector, so normally when the interrupt fires, it pulls the vector and jumps the interrupt handler. This doesn't do it, it merely resumes execution. This gives you a 1 cycle latency interrupt response. No more clock slides on a timer. Perfectly stable rasters every time. So then there's the 65CS02, which is W65CO2, but you don't have BRR, BBS, SMB, or RMB. You'll probably only come across this if you do Atari Lynx programming, and then even then only the Atari Lynx 1 has it. I think the Atari Lynx 2 has a 65CO2, but since the one has the CS, you have to limit yourself to a CS. Bit of a mess there too. Then there's the 65CeO2, and boy do I wish these things actually existed in the real world. So it's based on the R65CO2, so it doesn't have the W commands, no stop or WAI. It adds a B register, which is just a stash for the A register to give a word value. You can't actually do accumulator-based operations with it. But it also has a Z index register, which is basically a clone of Y. So everything you could do with Y, you can now do with Z. It adds word instructions, so the 16-bit operations of DEW, INW, ROW, ASW, and PHW, which is -1, +1, shift 1, left and right, etc. And you can push a word onto the stack. Oddly, there's no PLW that I could see, so you can't pull a word from the stack. You can only push them to the stack. It also adds TSY and TIS, so you can use the Y register as a stack indexer as well as X. They optimize clock counts heavily, so now you have one clock instructions, and they shaved as many clocks off a bunch of instructions as they could. The Mega 65 takes this even further by adding 32-bit versions of instructions, as well as pulling in all bytes of the instruction in one clock. So typically, if you do, LDA 16-bit ABS, it has to spend 3 clock cycles reading in 3 bytes of the instruction data. The Mega 65 can just pull that in one clock. And that's basically the grand tour of the family that matters.